Montana Territory, 1878. The wind carried a whisper of autumn across the rolling plains, stirring the tall grass that surrounded the modest cabin Vincent Forrester had built with his own two hands. At 25, Vincent had already lived more life than most men twice his age. He'd driven cattle across 3 states, fought off rustlers, survived a lightning strike, and even spent a winter alone in the mountains when a blizzard separated him from his outfit. But nothing in his young life had prepared him for the mystery that awaited him on his porch that September morning. Vincent stepped outside, stretching his lean frame in the early light. His dark brown hair fell across his forehead as he squinted toward the horizon. The stubble on his jaw was just a day old, not yet enough to scratch against his collar. He wore simple clothes, worn denim, a faded blue shirt, boots that had seen too many trails. He was handsome in an unassuming way, with features that hardened when necessary but softened when he thought no one was looking. His gaze dropped to a cloth-covered plate near his boots. The fabric was delicate, nicer than anything he owned, and when he lifted the corner, the scent of fresh-baked molasses cookies filled his senses. Vincent stared at the offering, bewildered. He lived alone, miles from the nearest neighbor, by careful design. The frontier had taught him one lesson above all others: attachment was a luxury he couldn't afford, not in this life. Not in this wild place where death rode alongside every man who dared to stake a claim. A man needs nothing but his horse, his gun, and open country, his father had told him before the fever took him. Vincent had been 16 then, and those words had been burned into his heart like a cattle brand. In the years since, he'd proven them true time and again. Everyone he'd ever cared for had eventually disappeared, by choice, by fate, or by a bullet. The West was no place for softness. Yet here were cookies on his porch, still warm, placed by a hand he couldn't name. Vincent knelt down, examining the ground around his cabin. A set of delicate footprints trailed away from his porch toward the east. Someone had been here while he slept, someone light and careful, and the thought made him uneasy. Not because he feared danger, but because he feared something far more unsettling: kindness with no apparent purpose. He picked up a cookie and sniffed it suspiciously before taking a tentative bite. The flavor flooded his mouth, sweet, rich, with just the right amount of spice. It had been years since he'd tasted something made with such care. Vincent wondered who she was baking for. No woman traveled these parts alone just to deliver cookies to a stranger. She must have been heading somewhere else to someone else. He was just a stop along the way. Still, as he chewed the unexpected gift, something stirred in him, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it: curiosity. 3 miles east, Ruby Daniels hummed softly to herself as she kneaded dough in the kitchen of her uncle's trading post. At 20 years old, she wore her chestnut brown hair in a practical braid that fell just past her shoulders, though rebellious tendrils always managed to escape around her heart-shaped face. Today she wore a simple blue calico dress with a practical white apron, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows as she worked. "You were out early this morning," her Uncle Henry remarked, adjusting his spectacles as he organized the ledger. Ruby's cheeks colored slightly. "Just wanted to enjoy the sunrise," she said, not meeting his eyes. Henry chuckled. "And I suppose the batch of cookies that disappeared had nothing to do with it." "I'm just being neighborly," she said, concentrating harder on her dough. "It's what my mother would have done." Ruby had arrived at Daniel's trading post just 2 weeks prior, sent west after her parents passing to live with her only remaining relative. The journey from Boston had been long and difficult, but not nearly as difficult as the weight of isolation that had settled around her since her arrival. The post saw traffic from time to time: trappers, soldiers, the occasional settler family, but conversation was brief and practical. No one lingered. No one except her thoughts of the quiet cowboy who had ridden through last week, his eyes the color of a summer storm, his manner polite but distant. She'd offered him coffee, which he'd accepted with a nod and a "thank you, miss," that had stayed with her long after he'd gone. Vincent Forrester. Her uncle had mentioned the name after he'd left, a young rancher who kept to himself, came in for supplies once a month, and never asked for credit. "Good man," her uncle had said, but haunted by something. "Folks say he lost his whole family to Blackfoot raiders when he was just a boy, been on his own ever since." Perhaps it was foolish to leave cookies at a stranger's door. But Ruby had grown up in a world where community meant something, where neighbors cared for neighbors through harsh winters and difficult times. The West seemed determined to beat that instinct out of people, but Ruby was equally determined to keep it alive. "Your heart's too soft for these parts," her uncle said, but his tone was gentle. "Men like Forrester aren't looking for charity or companionship." Ruby looked up, her green eyes flashing. Everyone needs something to remind them they're human, Uncle Henry, even the ones who pretend they don't. Henry sighed, just be careful with that kindness of yours. Not everyone deserves it. Ruby said nothing, but as she shaped the dough into loaves, she wondered if her uncle was right. Perhaps leaving those cookies had been a foolish gesture. The cowboy probably thought her strange, or worse, forward. She resolved to forget about it, to focus instead on making a life here, however temporary it might be. After all, she had plans of her own. Once she'd saved enough from helping at the trading post, she intended to continue west to Oregon, where she'd heard a young woman could find work as a schoolteacher without too many questions asked. The frontier wasn't her final destination. It was merely a passage to something better. 3 days later, Vincent rode toward Daniel's trading post with an empty flour sack folded in his saddlebag. It wasn't his usual time to resupply, but he'd found himself thinking about those cookies more than he cared to admit. The mystery nagged at him, disrupting the careful routine he'd built. As he approached the weathered wooden structure, he noticed a figure in a blue dress sweeping the porch. She looked up at the sound of his horse, shading her eyes against the sun. Vincent slowed his mount to a walk, suddenly uncertain. He'd rehearsed what he might say if he encountered the cookie baker, but now that he was here, the words seemed to evaporate like morning dew. "Good morning," she called, her voice carrying across the yard. "You're back sooner than usual, Mr. Forrester." Vincent swung down from his saddle, leading his horse to the hitching post. "You know me?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Uncle Henry keeps track of all his customers," she said with a small smile. "I'm Ruby Daniels. I've been helping out at the post for a couple of weeks now." Vincent nodded, studying her. She was pretty, with a natural grace to her movements that suggested Eastern upbringing. Her eyes were bright, intelligent, and oddly familiar, though he couldn't place why. "You need supplies?" she asked, stepping back to allow him access to the door. "Flour," he said, finding his voice. "And I had some cookies appear on my porch a few days back. Thought I should return the plate." Ruby's cheeks flushed slightly. "No need," she said quickly. "It was just a neighborly gesture." "Not many neighbors out this way," Vincent said, studying her face. "Especially not ones who bake like that." "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said. "It's just. Where I come from, people look after one another, even strangers." Vincent frowned. "Where exactly do you come from, Miss Daniels?" "Boston," she replied, "though I'm not staying in Montana long. I'm just passing through on my way to Oregon." Something about her declaration irritated him, though he couldn't say why. "The trail to Oregon doesn't run through my property," he said more curtly than he intended. Ruby's expression cooled. "No, I suppose it doesn't. Your flour is inside, Mr. Forrester." She turned and went into the trading post, leaving Vincent feeling like a heel. He'd handled that poorly. It had been a simple kindness, nothing more, and he'd responded like a suspicious old coot. Inside, Henry Daniels greeted him warmly. "Vincent, wasn't expecting you for a few more weeks." "Running low on flour," Vincent lied, avoiding looking at Ruby, who was now arranging canned goods on a shelf. As Henry measured out the flour, Vincent cleared his throat. "There's a pack of wolves been circling near the western ridge," he said. "Might want to keep an eye out if either of you travel that way." He glanced at Ruby, who was pretending not to listen. "Appreciate the warning," Henry said. "Ruby, did you hear that? No wandering west on your morning walks." Ruby nodded without turning. "I hear wolves only attack if they're desperate or provoked." "Or if they think they've found easy prey," Vincent countered. Now she did look at him, her green eyes challenging. "I'm tougher than I look, Mr. Forrester." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Vincent felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "I don't doubt it, Miss Daniels. But wolves don't care much about human determination." Henry handed Vincent his flour. "That'll be 60 cents. Vincent paid, nodded his thanks, and headed for the door. He paused, then turned back. "Those cookies," he said. "They were the best I've had since my mother was alive." Ruby's expression softened. "I'm glad you enjoyed them." "Next time," he said, surprising himself, "you could knock on the door instead of leaving them like some kind of prairie ghost." With that, he left, mounting his horse and riding away before she could respond. As he headed home, Vincent wondered what had possessed him to say such a thing. There shouldn't be a next time. He didn't want there to be a next time. But for the first time in years, Vincent Forrester realized he'd just told a lie to himself. A week passed and Ruby found herself watching the trail for any sign of Vincent Forrester. She told herself it was merely curiosity, a natural interest in one of the few people her age within 50 miles, but deep down, she recognized it as something more dangerous. "Letter for you," Henry said one afternoon, handing her an envelope. "From that school in Oregon you wrote to." Ruby took it eagerly, breaking the seal. As she read, her expression fell. "Bad news?" Henry asked. "They've filled the position," she said, folding the letter carefully, "but they'll keep my application on file for future openings." Henry patted her shoulder. "There are other schools, Ruby, or you could consider staying here longer. The Post does better with a woman's touch." Ruby forced a smile. "I'll find my place, Uncle Henry." But as the days passed, Ruby found herself wondering where exactly that place might be. Boston was behind her, Oregon now uncertain. And Montana was just a harsh, beautiful wilderness that demanded everything and promised nothing. Late one afternoon, as clouds gathered on the horizon, Ruby heard hoofbeats approaching. She looked up from the garden she'd been tending to see Vincent Forrester riding toward the post, leading a second horse laden with what appeared to be deer carcasses. "Mr. Forrester," she called, standing and brushing dirt from her skirt. "Looks like you had a successful hunt." Vincent dismounted, his movements fluid and economical. "More than we can use at the ranch," he said. "Thought your uncle might want to trade." Ruby noticed the "we" but didn't comment. She'd heard Vincent had hired a ranch hand recently, an older man passing through who'd worked cattle before. "Uncle Henry's making a delivery to the fort," she said. "Won't be back until tomorrow." Vincent frowned, looking at the deer. "These won't keep in this heat." Ruby considered for a moment. "I could help you dress them," she offered. "We have a smokehouse out back." Vincent raised an eyebrow. "You know how to butcher a deer." "I've been learning," she said with a small shrug. "Uncle Henry says I need frontier skills if I'm going to survive out here." Something flickered across Vincent's face, concern perhaps or doubt. "It's not easy work." "Neither is living," she replied simply. They worked through the afternoon, Ruby following Vincent's instructions as they prepared the meat for smoking. To her credit, she neither flinched nor complained, even when her hands grew slick with blood and her back ached from bending. "You're not what I expected," Vincent said as they washed up afterward. "What did you expect?" Ruby asked, drying her hands on her apron. Vincent seemed to consider his words carefully. "Eastern women usually can't stomach frontier work. They come west with dreams and leave with nightmares." Ruby laughed, the sound surprising them both. "Mr. Forrester, you clearly haven't met many Eastern women. We're not all delicate flowers waiting to wilt." "Vincent," he said suddenly, "if we're going to be neighbors, even temporary ones, you might as well use my name." Ruby looked up at him, noticing how the fading light softened his features. "Vincent," she repeated, tasting the name, "then you must call me Ruby." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. In the distance, thunder rumbled. "Storm's coming," Vincent said, looking at the sky. "I should head back." Ruby followed his gaze to the dark clouds rushing toward them. "That looks bad, you might get caught in it." Vincent hesitated, clearly torn between the prospect of a soaking and the awkwardness of staying. "I have coffee," Ruby offered, "and maybe even some cookies left." The first heavy drops began to fall as Vincent nodded. "I appreciate the offer." Inside, Ruby lit the lamps as rain began to pound against the roof. She moved with practiced efficiency, setting water to boil and arranging cookies on a plate while Vincent stood awkwardly near the door. "You can sit," she said, gesturing to the small table. "I don't bite." Vincent settled into a chair, removing his hat and placing it on his knee. "Your uncle trusts you alone here." Ruby paused in her preparation. "I'm not a child, Vincent. I'm 20 years old and perfectly capable of looking after myself for a night." "I didn't mean," he stopped, reconsidering. "It's just not common is all." Ruby poured the coffee and sat across from him. "Nothing about my life has been common. My parents raised me to think for myself, to read widely, to question everything. When they died of influenza last winter, everyone expected me to marry the first suitable man who offered, but I chose to come west instead." "To teach in Oregon," Vincent recalled. Ruby nodded, though that plan seems to be delayed. "Why teaching?" he asked, taking a sip of coffee. "I believe education is the foundation of civilization," she said simply, "and women make natural teachers. We understand patience and persistence." Vincent smiled slightly. "My mother used to say something similar." She taught me to read by candlelight after long days of work. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, Vincent agreed, his expression distant. Then, as if catching himself revealing too much, he straightened. This is good coffee. Ruby recognized the deflection but didn't press. Outside, the storm raged, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the eaves. Looks like you might be here a while, she observed. Unless you fancy a midnight swim back to your ranch. Vincent frowned, looking toward the window. I don't want to impose. It's not an imposition, Ruby said, though I should warn you if you stay I might ask questions. I'm curious by nature. Vincent's expression remained carefully neutral. What kind of questions? Why does a young man choose to live alone miles from anyone? What drives him to wake up each day on a struggling ranch when there are easier ways to make a living? Why does he look at people as if he's measuring the distance between himself and disappointment? Vincent set down his cup with deliberate care. Those are mighty personal questions, Ruby. Yes, she admitted. They are. For a long moment, only the sound of the rain filled the space between them. Then Vincent surprised her. My parents and younger sister were killed in a Blackfoot raid when I was 17, he said, his voice even. I was away hunting, came back to find everything gone, family, home, future, all of it ashes. Ruby's hand moved unconsciously toward his, stopping just short of touching. I'm so sorry. It taught me something important, Vincent continued, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. Attachment is a weakness out here. The more you care, the more you can lose. That sounds like a lonely way to live, Ruby said softly. Vincent met her gaze directly. Better lonely than broken. Is it? She challenged. My parents loved each other completely for 22 years. When my father died, my mother followed within a week. Some might call that tragic, I call it beautiful. They lived fully, loved deeply, and left together. And left you alone, Vincent pointed out. Ruby didn't flinch. They gave me everything I needed to continue without them. Education, confidence, memories of love. I'm not afraid to care, Vincent. I'm afraid not to. The intensity of the moment stretched between them, punctuated by a crack of lightning that illuminated the room. When darkness returned, something had shifted. You should get some rest, Vincent said, standing. I'll keep watch out here. There's a cot in the back room, Ruby offered. Uncle Henry uses it when customers stay overnight. Vincent nodded. Thank you. As Ruby prepared to retire to her own small bedroom, she paused at her door. Vincent. He looked up, his face half in shadow. Not everyone leaves, she said simply. Some people stay. Before he could respond, she slipped into her room, leaving Vincent alone with the storm and thoughts more turbulent than the weather outside. Morning arrived with clarity, the storm having washed the world clean. Vincent woke on the cot, momentarily disoriented before remembering where he was. He rose quickly, straightening his clothes and running a hand through his hair. When he emerged from the back room, he found Ruby already dressed and preparing breakfast, her hair neatly braided, her movements purposeful. Good morning, she said, not looking up from the stove. Hungry. I should get back, Vincent said, feeling strangely awkward in the daylight. Check on the ranch. Ruby nodded, hiding her disappointment. Of course, but you should eat first. No sense riding on an empty stomach. Vincent hesitated, then nodded, much obliged. They ate in companionable silence, the events of the previous evening hanging between them. Vincent couldn't remember the last time he'd shared so much of himself with anyone, and the revelation left him feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way he'd spent years avoiding. About last night, he began, setting down his fork. You don't need to explain, Ruby interrupted. We all have our ghosts, Vincent. He studied her face, searching for judgment or pity and finding neither. Instead, he saw understanding and something else, a quiet determination that both unsettled and attracted him. Thank you for the meal, he said, standing, and for the company. Ruby walked him to the door where his horse waited, already saddled. I took the liberty, she explained, figured you'd be eager to get back. Vincent stepped onto the porch, then turned. Ruby, Whatever he intended to say was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. 3 men on horseback were coming fast toward the trading post, their manner suggesting urgency. Vincent's hand moved instinctively to his gun. Get inside, he said quietly. Ruby frowned. Why, they're probably just customers. Customers don't ride like that, Vincent said, his eyes narrowing. Get inside and stay there." Something in his tone convinced her. Ruby retreated into the trading post as Vincent stepped forward, positioning himself between the approaching riders and the door. The men reined in sharply, dust billowing around their mounts. The leader, a hard-faced man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, smiled without warmth. "Well now, if it ain't Vincent Forrester," he drawled. "Long way from your ranch, ain't you?" Vincent kept his expression neutral. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Heard this place has a pretty new shopkeeper," the scarred man said, his gaze moving to the door behind Vincent. "Thought we'd come introduce ourselves." "The owner's away," Vincent said evenly. "Just me here today." The scarred man exchanged glances with his companions. "Funny, we heard different." Vincent didn't move. "Then you heard wrong." Tension stretched between them, a tangible thing in the morning air. Vincent was acutely aware of being outnumbered, but equally aware that Ruby was behind him, vulnerable in ways she couldn't understand. "You always were protective of what ain't yours, Forrester," the scarred man said. "Remember that time in Wyoming, that saloon girl you thought needed saving?" Vincent's jaw tightened. "That was a long time ago, Farley." "Not so long I've forgotten the beating you gave me," Farley spat. "Been waiting to return the favor." Behind him, Vincent heard the trading post door open. Despite his instruction, Ruby had emerged, a shotgun held confidently in her hands. "This is private property, gentlemen," she said, her voice steady. "Unless you're here to trade, I suggest you move along." Farley's eyes narrowed, taking in the young woman with the shotgun. "Well now, ain't you a spirited one? Maybe we should take our time, get to know each other proper." Ruby chambered around, the sound cutting through the morning stillness. "I'm not interested in making your acquaintance, sir." Vincent had never felt so simultaneously proud and terrified. Ruby's courage was admirable, but these men were dangerous, killers who wouldn't hesitate to hurt a woman who defied them. "3 against 1 ain't good odds, Forrester," Farley said, his hand hovering near his gun, "even with your little friend there." "4 against 3 is better," came a new voice. Henry Daniels rode into view from the opposite direction, his own rifle drawn. "And I don't much like finding trouble at my trading post, Farley." Farley assessed the situation, clearly unhappy with how it had turned. "Just passing through, Daniels, no harm intended." "Then pass through," Henry said coldly, "and don't stop until you hit the territory line." With a final glare at Vincent, Farley wheeled his horse around. "This ain't finished, Forrester," he called over his shoulder as the 3 men rode away. Only when they were out of sight did Vincent release the breath he'd been holding. He turned to Ruby, whose face had paled slightly now that the danger had passed. "You should have stayed inside," he said, more harshly than he intended. Ruby lowered the shotgun. "And you shouldn't have lied about being alone. I can take care of myself." Henry dismounted, looking between them with concern. "Someone want to tell me what that was about?" Vincent shook his head. "Old trouble, I should go." "Vincent," Ruby began, but he was already mounting his horse. "Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Daniels," he said formally. "Mr. Daniels." With that he rode away, trying to ignore the confusion and hurt in Ruby's eyes. It was better this way. Farley's appearance was a stark reminder of why Vincent kept to himself. His past had a way of catching up to him, and he wouldn't risk Ruby being caught in the crossfire. As he rode, Vincent tried to convince himself he was doing the right thing. But for the first time in years, the solitude ahead felt less like safety and more like punishment. 2 weeks passed without a word from Vincent. Ruby tried to focus on her work at the trading post, but her thoughts kept returning to that morning, to the look in Vincent's eyes before he rode away, to the unspoken words that hung between them. "He's protecting you," Henry had explained after Vincent left. "Farley and his gang are bad news, been rustling cattle up and down the territory for years. Vincent had a run-in with them back when he was working as a ranch hand in Wyoming. Stopped them from hurting a woman, from what I heard." "So he's running from them?" Ruby had asked. Henry shook his head. "Not running, just trying to keep his troubles to himself. That's Vincent's way." Now, as Ruby swept the trading post porch in the late afternoon light, she found herself watching the trail again, hoping for a glimpse of a lone rider. She was angry with herself for caring so much about a man who clearly preferred his solitude to her company. The sound of an approaching wagon drew her attention. A family was making their way toward the trading post, a tired-looking couple with 3 small children huddled in the back among their meager possessions. Ruby set aside her broom and went to greet them. "Welcome to Daniel's trading post," she called. "Can I help you?" The man, his face weathered beyond his years, nodded gratefully. "Just passing through," he said. "Need supplies if you got them, we can pay." "Of course," Ruby said warmly. "Come inside, you look like you could use some rest and a hot meal." The family followed her into the trading post, the children wide-eyed and quiet. As Ruby helped them gather provisions, their story emerged in pieces. They'd lost their farm in Kansas to drought and were heading to Washington Territory, where the man's brother had offered them work. "It's hard country between here and there," Henry warned as he calculated their bill, "especially with winter coming on." The woman clutched her youngest child closer. "We don't have much choice," she said softly. Ruby exchanged a glance with her uncle, a silent communication passing between them. "You're welcome to stay here tonight," Henry offered. "Got a room in the back you can use, no charge." The man's pride warred visibly with practicality. "We can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Ruby said quickly. "It's neighborliness, and in return, perhaps your wife could help me with some mending. I'm terrible with a needle." This small fiction preserved the man's dignity, and the arrangements were made. That evening, as Ruby helped prepare a simple meal for their guests, she found herself thinking of Vincent again. Would he have made the same offer? Or would his instinct to keep people at a distance have prevailed? After dinner, as the family settled in for the night, Ruby stepped outside to enjoy the cool evening air. The stars were emerging one by one, brilliant against the darkening sky. "You did a good thing today," Henry said, joining her on the porch. Ruby smiled. "We did, it's what my parents would have done." Henry studied his niece's profile. "You're a lot like your mother. She never could turn away someone in need." "Is that a compliment or a warning?" Ruby asked, glancing at him. "Both, I reckon," Henry said with a chuckle. "This territory's full of people with nothing but need." "You can't help them all." Ruby turned her gaze back to the stars. "No," she agreed, "but we can help the ones in front of us." They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Henry spoke again. "I saw Vincent Forrester in town yesterday." Ruby's heart quickened, though she tried not to show it. "Oh." "Asked after you," Henry continued. In his way, wanted to know if there'd been any more trouble. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That we've been fine, but that you've been watching that trail like it might disappear if you look away." Ruby's cheeks burned. "Uncle Henry." Henry held up his hands. He deserved to know. That boy's been alone too long. Sometimes a man needs a push to remember what matters. Ruby shook her head, embarrassed and touched by her uncle's interference. He made his choice. He rode away. Maybe Henry conceded. Or maybe he just needed time to figure out what he's really running from. With that cryptic observation, Henry went inside, leaving Ruby alone with the night sky and her thoughts. The following morning, Ruby rose early to help the traveling family prepare for their journey. As she was packing food for their trip, the trading post door opened. Vincent Forrester stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "Morning," he said, his eyes finding Ruby immediately. "Heard you might have some flour to trade." Ruby's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "We might, depends what you're offering." A ghost of a smile touched Vincent's lips. "Fresh venison." "And an apology." Ruby busied herself with the packages she was preparing. "Venison we can always use, not sure about apologies." Vincent stepped further into the trading post, noticing the family gathering their belongings. He nodded to them before turning his attention back to Ruby. "Could I speak with you outside?" Ruby hesitated, then nodded. "Let me finish here first." She completed packing the family's provisions, adding a small bag of candy for the children. As the travelers prepared to leave, Ruby impulsively pressed a piece of paper into the woman's hand. "If you reach Oregon and hear of any teaching positions," she explained, "this is where to write." The woman squeezed Ruby's hand. "Thank you for everything." After the wagon had rumbled away, Ruby found Vincent waiting on the porch, gazing out at the landscape. "You're good with people," he observed as she approached. Ruby stood beside him, keeping a careful distance. "It's not difficult, people just want to be seen." Vincent turned to face her. "I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything, Vincent," Ruby said, meeting his gaze directly. "We're barely acquaintances." Her words stung, but Vincent recognized the hurt behind them. I rode away because I was afraid, he admitted, not of Farley but of what might happen to you because of me. Ruby's expression softened slightly. I'm not afraid of your past. Maybe you should be, Vincent said. I've made enemies, dangerous ones. Everyone has a past, Ruby countered. I'm more interested in the future. Vincent looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the strength beneath her beauty, the determination behind her gentle manner. Why did you leave those cookies on my porch that day? The question caught Ruby off guard. She laughed nervously. I told you it was just being neighborly. No, Vincent said quietly, it was more than that. You saw something, didn't you, when I came to the trading post that first time? Ruby's smile faded. She looked away, gathering her thoughts. I saw someone who needed reminding that he wasn't alone, she finally said. Someone who'd forgotten that the world can offer sweetness, not just bitterness. Her honesty humbled him. I've been thinking about what you said, Vincent admitted, about attachment being a strength, not a weakness. And, Ruby prompted when he fell silent. And I think I've been a coward, Vincent said, the words difficult but necessary. It's easier to stay alone than to risk caring again, but easier isn't always right. Ruby studied his face. What are you saying, Vincent? I'm saying I'd like to try, he said simply, to be a neighbor, a friend. To see where it leads. It wasn't a declaration of love, they were nowhere near that, but it was an opening, a possibility neither had acknowledged before. I'd like that, Ruby said, a genuine smile spreading across her face. Though I should warn you, I ask a lot of questions. Vincent found himself smiling back. I'm learning to answer them. As they stood together on the trading post porch, the future stretching before them like the vast Montana sky, Vincent realized something important. For the first time in years, he was looking forward, not back, and it felt like coming home. Autumn yielded to winter, and the Montana territory transformed under a blanket of snow. The trading post became a refuge for travelers caught in the harsh weather, and Ruby found herself busier than ever. Vincent came by more frequently now, sometimes with legitimate trading needs, other times with thin excuses that fooled no one, least of all Henry, who watched their cautious courtship with amused approval. They established a rhythm. Vincent would help with the heavier work around the trading post, and Ruby would send him home with baked goods that needed to be eaten before they spoiled. They talked during these visits, slowly revealing themselves to each other in careful increments. Ruby learned that Vincent had worked as a ranch hand, a scout for the army, and briefly as a deputy in a Wyoming town before striking out on his own. Vincent discovered that Ruby had been engaged once in Boston to a banker's son who'd broken it off when her parents died and left her with little inheritance. His loss, Vincent had said simply, and the matter was closed. One bitter January evening, as a blizzard raged outside, Vincent and Ruby sat by the trading post fire, playing chess on a board Henry had carved years ago. Checkmate, Ruby announced, capturing Vincent's king with a triumphant smile. Vincent shook his head in mock dismay. That's 3 games in a row. I'm beginning to think those Eastern schools taught you something after all. Ruby laughed, the sound warming the room more effectively than the fire. My father taught me, he said, chess builds character. And what did your mother teach you? Vincent asked, resetting the pieces. Ruby's expression grew thoughtful. To recognize the difference between what people say and what they mean. To look for the truth behind the words. Vincent's hands stilled on the chess pieces. And what do you see when you look at me, Ruby Daniels? The directness of his question caught her off guard. She studied him across the board, this man who had gradually become essential to her days. I see someone who's been carrying a heavy load alone for too long, she said softly. Someone who's afraid to put it down because he's forgotten what it feels like not to hurt. Vincent swallowed hard, her insight cutting through his carefully constructed defenses. And does that frighten you? Ruby reached across the chessboard, covering his hand with hers. No, Vincent, it makes me want to help you carry it. The moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken feelings. Vincent turned his hand to clasp hers, the simple touch more intimate than any embrace. The trading post door burst open, shattering the moment. Henry stumbled in, half frozen and supporting another man who looked even worse. Need help, Henry gasped, found him on the trail. Vincent and Ruby sprang into action, helping the men to the fire. The stranger was barely conscious, his lips blue with cold, his clothes inadequate for the brutal Montana winter. Stagecoach overturned, Henry explained as Ruby brought blankets. Others didn't make it, found him walking, delirious, tried to fight me when I offered help. Vincent examined the man's frostbitten fingers and toes. He needs a doctor. Nearest one's at Fort Benton, Henry said grimly. No reaching there in this storm. Ruby was already gathering supplies. We need to warm him slowly, she said, her voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. Vincent, can you get his wet clothes off? I'll prepare hot broth. They worked through the night, taking turns watching over the stranger. By morning, his fever had broken, and he was able to speak. Name's Thomas Reed, he told them weakly, was heading to Helena, Gold Claim. Well, Mr. Reed, Ruby said, offering him more broth, your claim will have to wait until you're stronger. Reed looked around at the three people who had saved his life. Why'd you help me? Don't even know me. That's not how things work out here, Ruby said simply. We help because next time it might be us needing the help. Vincent, watching from across the room, felt something shift inside him. Ruby's words echoed his own mother's philosophy, a view he'd abandoned after losing his family. The frontier wasn't just about survival of the fittest, it was also about community, about connecting despite the hardships. As the days passed and Reed recovered, Vincent found himself spending more time at the trading post than his own ranch. His hired hand, an older cowboy named Mac, gave him knowing looks when he rode out each morning but said nothing. In late February, as winter maintained its grip on the territory, Henry announced his intention to travel to Fort Benton for supplies. Someone needs to watch the post, he said, looking between Vincent and Ruby. And someone needs to keep an eye on her, he added, nodding toward Ruby with a wink. Uncle Henry, Ruby protested. I'm perfectly capable of getting into trouble, Henry finished for her. Remember those trappers last month? Vincent raised an eyebrow. What trappers? Ruby shot her uncle a warning look. It was nothing. Just a misunderstanding. 3 trappers thought they could help themselves to goods without paying, Henry explained despite Ruby's glare. Found my niece here holding them at bay with that shotgun until one of our regular customers happened by. Vincent frowned. Why didn't you tell me about this? Because it was handled, Ruby said firmly, and I knew you'd worry. The concern in Vincent's eyes confirmed her suspicion. I'll stay while Henry's gone, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ruby opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. The truth was she welcomed Vincent's presence and not just for protection. Henry left the following morning, promising to return within a week. Vincent moved his bedroll into the trading post's back room, maintaining propriety while staying close enough to respond to any trouble. The arrangement should have been awkward, but instead it felt strangely natural. They fell into a domestic routine, Ruby cooking and managing the trading post, Vincent tending to the livestock and handling the more demanding customers. In the evenings, they read by the fire or talked for hours about everything and nothing. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Ruby finally asked the question that had been on her mind for months. Vincent, who was Farley talking about, the saloon girl in Wyoming. Vincent's expression darkened. He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. Her name was Sarah. She worked at a saloon where I used to have a drink after my shift at the ranch. Farley and his men came through town, causing trouble. Sarah refused his advances, and he didn't take kindly to it. What happened? Ruby asked softly. I stepped in, Vincent said, his voice flat. There was a fight. I got the better of Farley, left him with that scar he's so proud of. His men dragged him away, and I thought that was the end of it. Ruby sensed there was more to the story. But it wasn't. Vincent shook his head. They came back a week later, burned the saloon to the ground with Sarah inside, left a note saying I was next. Ruby's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, Vincent. I tracked them for months, Vincent continued, his eyes still fixed on the flames. But they disappeared across the border into Canada. By the time they resurfaced, I'd given up on revenge. Decided living well was better punishment. Is that when you came to Montana? Vincent nodded, bought the ranch, tried to forget, but seeing Farley again that day at the trading post. It brought it all back. Ruby moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. You were protecting me the way you tried to protect her. And I failed her, Vincent said, his voice rough with emotion. I couldn't bear to fail you too. Vincent, look at me, Ruby said, waiting until his eyes met hers. You are not responsible for the evil others do. You tried to help Sarah, that matters. Does it? He asked bleakly. Yes, Ruby said firmly, it does. In a world where it's easier to look away, you chose to stand up. That's who you are. Vincent studied her face in the firelight, wondering how this woman he'd known for such a short time could see him so clearly. Ruby, he said, his voice barely audible, I think I'm falling in love with you. The words hung between them, both terrifying and inevitable. Ruby's eyes widened, but she didn't pull away. I know, she said simply. I've been waiting for you to realize it. A startled laugh escaped Vincent. You knew before I did. Ruby's smile was radiant. I knew the day you came back to apologize. No man rides through a snowstorm to trade for flower he doesn't need unless his heart is involved. Vincent touched her cheek gently, as if she might disappear. I don't have much to offer except a struggling ranch and a complicated past. I'm not asking for more than you are, Vincent, Ruby said. Just a man who's willing to try even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. The distance between them vanished as Vincent leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that felt like a promise. Ruby's hands found his shoulders, steadying herself against the rush of emotion. When they finally parted, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. What happens now? Ruby smiled. Now we figure it out together. Outside, the winter wind howled, but inside the trading post, something precious and fragile had taken root, something that might just be strong enough to withstand whatever storms lay ahead. Spring arrived with its particular Montana ferocity, mud and snow melt creating rivers where paths had been, followed by explosions of wildflowers across the prairie. Henry had returned from Fort Benton to find his niece and Vincent Forrester irrevocably changed, their relationship having crossed a boundary that couldn't be redrawn. About time was all he'd said, but his eyes twinkled with approval. As April turned to May, Ruby found herself torn between two futures. The school in Oregon had finally written back, offering her a position starting in September. It was everything she'd planned for: security, respectability, a chance to use her education. But Montana had changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The trading post no longer felt like a temporary stop but a place where she belonged. And then there was Vincent, whose ranch was showing signs of prosperity after a difficult winter. You're quiet today, Vincent observed as they rode along the ridge overlooking his property. He'd invited Ruby to see the new calves, an excuse to spend the day together away from the trading post's constant demands. Ruby patted her horse's neck, just thinking. About Oregon, Vincent asked, his voice carefully neutral. She glanced at him, surprised. How did you know? Henry mentioned the letter. Vincent kept his eyes on the horizon. It's a good opportunity. Ruby studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. It's what I came west for. I know, Vincent said, you'd make a fine teacher. They rode in silence for a while, the unspoken question hanging between them. Finally, Ruby reined in her horse. Ask me to stay, Vincent. He turned to face her, his expression conflicted. I can't do that, Ruby. I won't be the reason you give up your dreams. What if my dreams have changed? She challenged. What if they now include a trading post and a ranch and a man who still hasn't properly courted me? A smile tugged at Vincent's lips. Haven't I? I've brought you venison, fixed your roof, and rescued at least 3 customers who tried to cheat you. Ruby laughed. A woman expects flowers occasionally, Vincent Forrester, maybe even a dance or two. Vincent dismounted and approached her horse, looking up at her with sudden seriousness. What if I offered something more permanent than flowers? Ruby's heart skipped. What do you mean? Instead of answering, Vincent reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl. It was my mother's, he explained, the only thing I saved from the fire. Ruby stared at the ring, then at Vincent, her eyes wide. I'm not asking you to choose between your dreams and me, Vincent said. I'm asking if there's room in your dreams for us to build something together, here in Montana. Ruby dismounted, standing before him with tears shining in her eyes. Are you proposing, Vincent Forrester? Inelegantly it seems, he said with a self-deprecating smile. But yes, Ruby Daniels, I am asking you to marry me, to stay. To make a life here, whether that means teaching, running the trading post, or something else entirely. Ruby took his face in her hands. You know it won't be easy, we're both stubborn. We'll fight. And make up, Vincent added, his hands finding her waist. Your past might catch up with you again. Then we'll face it together. Ruby's smile bloomed slowly. Yes, Vincent. Yes, I'll marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her close, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of all they'd overcome and all that lay ahead. As they rode back toward the trading post to share their news with Henry, Ruby felt a profound sense of rightness. Oregon had been a dream born of necessity, a safe harbor after losing her parents. But Vincent and Montana represented something different, not an escape but a beginning. The wedding took place in June, a small affair at the trading post with Henry officiating and a handful of neighbors and regular customers in attendance. Ruby wore her mother's dress, carefully altered, with wildflowers in her hair. Vincent, unrecognizable from the solitary cowboy of months past, couldn't take his eyes off her. After the ceremony, as guests enjoyed the feast Ruby had prepared, Vincent found a moment alone with his new wife. Happy? He asked, his arm around her waist. Ruby leaned into him, surveying the gathering. Completely, though I'm still waiting for that dance you promised. Vincent laughed, then surprised her by leading her to a clear space beside the trading post. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon the newlyweds were moving together in a simple waltz, their happiness a tangible thing that spread to everyone watching. As the sun set over the Montana prairie, Ruby laid her head on Vincent's shoulder. I never told you, she murmured, why I really left those cookies on your porch that day. Vincent pulled back slightly to see her face. Why did you? Ruby's eyes sparkled with mischief. I saw how you looked at me that first time you came to the trading post, like you'd been struck by lightning but were trying hard not to show it. Vincent's eyebrows rose. That obvious was I. To me, Ruby said, I wanted to give you a reason to come back, to see if there was something worth exploring. Vincent shook his head, amazed at her perception. You knew before I did. Again. Sometimes, Ruby said, her expression softening, we need someone else to show us what's possible. As they swayed together under the vast Montana sky, Vincent Forrester realized how far he'd come from that lonely man who'd once believed attachment was weakness. Ruby had shown him another truth, that love wasn't a liability but a strength, that connection wasn't something to fear but to embrace. And as for those cookies she'd left on his porch, they weren't meant for anyone else. They had always been for him, a sweet invitation to a future he hadn't dared to imagine. A future that was now, improbably and wonderfully his.